Hi, it's Dr. Guthrie. It's a pleasure to be back with you again. We're having kind of a transition lesson now. We've done the New Testament, we've done the Old Testament. I didn't do that one gap in between, which is Palestine at the time of Jesus. And by the way, I did make a mistake last lesson. I wasn't certain when Jerome translated what was then the modern Latin Bible, which is called the Vulgate because it was the vulgar or common language at the time, and that was in about 370 to 380, and that became the Catholic Bible for still official Bible even now. So anyway, I did make a mistake. Of course, we all make mistakes. It's no big deal, but I wanted to correct it. This is Palestine at the time of Jesus, and I'm going to tell you the overall point right at the very beginning, and I'll explain why at the end. Of course, God picked the perfect time for the Messiah to arrive. The perfect time. It was the Jewish Messiah, so he had to come in a Jewish homeland. And I'll explain to you in the end why this was the perfect time to allow Christianity to grow. And now, what was the background of Palestine at the time? Well, last lesson we talked about, or 2 lessons ago, we talked about the Maccabean rebellion. And they had these rebellion off and on against the Greek overlords. And finally, by about 142 BC, they achieve a partial semi-independence, where they'll get some support from Rome and they'll pay off tribute to the Greeks and they'll be sort of independent. And that lasted until 110 when they became fully independent and became what's called the Hasmonean Kingdom. And they became rapidly just like any other Middle Eastern kingdom at the time. Ruthless, brutal, corrupt. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Greed corrupts absolutely also. So they became just like everybody else. But they were very ethnic, and they remained very ethnic, and they did have a different religion, which was their version of Judaism at that time. But again, it wasn't a benign, loving, generous type of situation at all. By this time, of course, Roman Empire power is growing and growing and growing. Finally, in 63 BC, a Roman conqueror named Pompey, Pompey, basically comes in and takes over and makes this part of the Roman Empire. Now, the Romans, as many conquerors do, tend to use local people as their surrogate leaders. They kind of pull their strings and keep an eye on them, and they have to implement their plans with the local people. Sometimes this is good, like we have used local people to administer our overseas colonies like Guam and Northern Marianas and stuff like that. And sometimes this is really bad, like the Nazis. And famous Nazi collaborator in Norway was a guy named Quisling who betrayed his own people to work for the conquering Nazis. He got hung afterwards. So if you're going to do that, you got to win. So the Romans used local people, and one of these people, they appointed the high priest. Remember, the priesthood in that time of Judaism was hereditary. The priests were the descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother. And they were priests, and the high priest office was very powerful. It was prosperous. It was a great snare. People would bribe people to get it and all that. And the Levites, by the way, were teachers of the law. And the law, of course, was extremely intricate in Jewish law at the time. And they were descendants of Moses. So this is a lot of hereditary. Much of your stature is what you're born into, what your family's born into. Which is different than we try to have here, where you make and break on your own rather than being born into an aristocratic family. And so they're using the local people to administer, and they came up with a guy named Antipater. Now, Antipater was actually an Idumean. Takes a little. Idumea is to the southeast of Jerusalem. So if you look at a map, and you go southeast from Jerusalem around the bottom of the Dead Sea, and there's a desert area there, and that's where the Idumeans were. They were a non-Jewish tribe. They were conquered by the Hasmonean Kingdom about 100 BC, and they were forced to convert, forced to be circumcised. That's probably went over real well. and forced to become Jewish. And Antipater was one of the Idumeans. And so when he gets into power with the Romans after Pompey takes over in 63 BC, of course he's regarded as a half-breed, not really Jewish, because of how ethnic these people were. And he became one of the major administrators. When he dies in 40 BC, he's succeeded by his son, Herod, who was appointed king. Now, calling Herod king is a little bit tricky. He was not an independent king. He was a local king, a servant of the Romans, kind of an administrative person, but not truly an independent king. He was an interesting, challenging man. He was a successful administrator. He stayed on this throne as a client king, is a good word for him, until he died, and which was in 4 BC. He was, like I said, a very effective administrator. He was a great builder. He built the temple. He rebuilt the temple, which had been demolished when the Babylonians conquered, and then had later been rebuilt in various stages. And he tore it down and put up a magnificent one, which is the temple that Jesus went to. He built several other major cities, Caesarea Maritima up on the coast. It's now underwater. It's an interesting archaeological underwater site, and a variety of other great buildings. That was part of his thing. He was, however, a ruthless, nasty, brutal administrator, but he was effective. The Romans had a joke about him that it was better to be Herod's pig than Herod's kin, because he wouldn't eat pork to continue to be a good Jew, but he killed off several of his sons, at least one of his wives, one of his mothers-in-law, because he was afraid they were plotting against him. It very well may have been. That's who plotted against you in those days. But you didn't want to be his relative, because you get yourself killed. And he was the King Herod of Matthew's gospel who tried to find the baby Jesus when the wise men told him that they'd come to recognize the King of the Jews and slaughter the children in Bethlehem. Would he have done that? Sure, he would have done that. That was his style, ruthless and brutal and aggressive. And he knew how much the people hated him. He kept himself in power with the power of the Romans. The Romans backed him up militarily, and he administered it. And he knew how much they hated him, so he spent a long time and effort and money to create a tomb for himself that the locals could not find. Because he knew he was going to die, we all die, and he knew that after he's dead, if the locals knew where he was buried, they would break into it and get his body out and defile it in all kinds of ways. There's been a debate in the archaeology magazine whether they found it recently or not. It's a long time, that's 2,000 years. But that shows that he knew what he was about. But like I said, he was an effective administrator. He dies in 4 BC, and his area of reign is broken up into 3. He has one of his sons, Herod Antipater. Herod Antipater, let me say it correctly. And he is the Herod of Jesus' time, other than the birth Herod. He's the Herod who beheaded John the Baptist. He's the Herod who was happy to meet Jesus at the time of Jesus' arrest. But he was given the Galilee, the area to the north, where the old northern kingdom was, which is where Jesus grew up, in Nazareth. He was born in Bethlehem, but he grew up in Nazareth. So he would have been the king at Jesus' upbringing and adulthood. That was the second king, Herod. He was called Herod Antipater. His brother Philip had the area to the east, across the Jordan, into what's really not Jewish territory. It was called the Decapolis, the 10 Greek cities that were placed in there at the time shortly after the time of Alexander. And it basically was a non-Jewish, Greek-speaking cosmopolitan area. And the third son, whose name is Archelaus, was given Judea, which is what they called the Old Kingdom of Judah, around Jerusalem and Hebron and that area. And he could hold on to that for 10 years, and he was apparently so incompetent that the Romans removed him. and sent out what they called a procurator or a consul, which was a Roman administrator, to administer it directly. This is how Pilate got there. Now you got to remember, this is not a premier administrative site of the Roman Empire. You're far away from Rome. You're at the eastern edge of the empire. You're in this area where you've got really a unique problem. In general, people were happy to be part of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire was huge. It was very prosperous because it had free trade. You had a free trade zone from England through Spain to North Africa to Egypt, over to Jerusalem, and back around to where Constantinople or Istanbul was. The whole area is a free trade zone. So you didn't have any restrictions on trade or taxes. You didn't have any customs if you wanted to travel between that. So the empire was very prosperous. Most people were delighted to be part of the empire. A lot of the German tribes that tried to butt their way in across the Rhine in the 100, 200 were actually trying to join the empire, not take it over. So it was a very prosperous time, but the Jewish people were always restive. They were always unhappy because they didn't want to be ruled by these Romans, these pagans, which they were. Romans clearly were pagans, or heathen, however you want to call them. And so you had this turmoil, low-level turmoil all the time, unhappiness, etc. And so you didn't get, it was not a premier assignment if you got sent out there. It's like the old days of the British Empire, where if you were unpopular but they needed to give you an administrative position, they send you to what's now Botswana, used to be Bechuanaland, or now Namibia, old Southwest Africa, or other these small islands out in the Pacific, kind of to the periphery of the empire to get rid of you. That's kind of what happened to the administrators sent to the Holy Land. And of course, incompetent, nasty administrators made the turmoil even worse. I mean, Pilate was a ruthless, brutal guy. And so you had this constant turmoil festering up. Now, you had three major groups that we know of in Palestine at the time when Jesus arrives. You had the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees are the old, wealthy, landed aristocrats, like the old British gentry of 200 years ago, where all these lords of this and earl of that and all that. And they had estates and they had money. They had political power. They were the Sanhedrin, which was the advisory council to the high priest and to the Romans. And they would meet there when Jesus was taken there as part of his trial. But they were very conservative politically. They were happy with what they had. They had money and power and status, and so you don't want to change anything if you got that. They were very conservative theologically. They recognized only the first 5 books, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's it. So therefore, some of the more modern ideas that had come into Jewish thinking, a resurrection, a Messiah, angels, the devil, they wouldn't buy it. They didn't agree with it at all. It wasn't in the first 5 books, because those things are not in the first 5 books. They wouldn't believe it. So it's a very conservative group, and they were Jerusalem-based. The second group are still somewhat of a mystery. They're the Essenes. The Essenes wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls have given us lots of hints. Now, a lot of the scrolls are just in fragments. The great big Isaiah scroll, which I have seen in the Israeli Museum, this huge long scroll, it's beautiful, but most of them are in fragments. So the Essene community were modern in many ways. They were believed in an afterlife, but they were very apocalyptic. They were looking for 2 different messiahs to come. One was going to be a religious messiah, which is what Jesus was, and another was going to be a political messiah like King David to drive the Romans away in a great battle and restore the political kingdom along the lines they wanted, get rid of the Romans. They were very apocalyptic. And remember, we talked about apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature is usually written at a time of great stress where you're unhappy with your rulers and you're happy with the situation, and you're expecting this miraculous divine intervention to come and destroy the evil people that are afflicting you, and you'll be this big battle, and you all will win, and you'll be in charge, and you'll have heaven on earth or heaven in heaven after that. Apocalyptic literature is popular at a time of great stress. So a lot of it was written in the intertestament period between 150, 200 BC up to this time frame because of all the turmoil they had with the Greeks that were ruling them and the Romans and stuff. We only have one apocalyptic book in the New Testament, and that's John. Revelation of John, and it's controversial and difficult. And these things get popular again when there's a time of great stress and people are unhappy about this or that. Then they go back and say the world's going to end and blah, blah, blah. Hadn't ended yet. So I don't ever try to predict when the world's going to end. So I'm not a big believer in apocalyptic literature because the people who write it really don't know. It's just their guess. And then the people who interpret it are guessing even more wildly. So anyway, the Essenes were looking for a big apocalyptic battle. They were very rigid. They were very ritually oriented. You had these extensive purification preparations where you would clean yourself time and again in these ritual baths, and to be their standard. And then when the Romans come back to attack in the great first Jewish rebellion of 66 to 70 AD, they go out to fight them and get wiped out, and they disappear in the history. And there was almost nothing known about them until we stumbled into the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a lot of debate whether they actually lived at Qumran, which is down on the valley, right on the shore of the Dead Sea, and the scrolls were buried in the caves up above, or whether they lived somewhere else in the Jerusalem area and hid them in those caves because they knew the caves were there and they wanted to hide them because they knew the war was starting. My own gut instinct, just a guess, is that they probably lived somewhere else, and that the Qumran area wasn't a community. Other people disagree with me. It's a very interesting, 4 different theories as to what it is. We won't go into it. That was one group. And the third group were the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees are difficult to define. They are not an official group. They are a community-based group. And they call themselves Pharisees. So you didn't have to go to school to be a Pharisee. You didn't have to get ordained to be a Pharisee. You were just a Pharisee. And they were community-based people. They worshiped in the synagogue. They would go to the temple some, of course. But they created community-based worship, which was the synagogues. They emerged at the end of the Babylonian exile in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. They were very legalistic. Couldn't pick corn on the Sabbath. You couldn't heal anybody on the Sabbath, et cetera, et cetera. Extremely legalistic. And that I think they lost the point of the law in regards of the adherence, because you can start to worship the law rather than the Lord. That's my own opinion. It's easy to have an opinion about this. But they were an important group. They remind me of a lot of the more fringy evangelicals we have now who aren't really how do you define what an evangelical is in American Protestantism? It's impossible because there's a whole gamut of relatively moderate people to these very conservative people. So that's kind of where the Pharisees were. Now, they were very important in the long-term nature of Judaism because they did not get wiped out by the Romans. They were not based in Jerusalem. They were based all over the Judean countryside. I'm certain there were some in Jerusalem when the Romans broke in. Romans besieged Jerusalem for 3 years, from 67 to 70 AD. And when they broke in, they basically killed everybody and burned the city down. But the Pharisees, many of them were still out in the countryside of Judea and Galilee, and they survived. And they kept Judaism alive. So the Judaism that we see now in our current time, 2,000 years later, is the descendants of Pharisaic Judaism. They were important in putting the Old Testament together in a final form, et cetera, et cetera. They were the third group that Jesus had to deal with. And they were more rivals of him because he was out in the community for the most part. He didn't preach in the temple that much. He was out in the community giving his messages, preaching his message, healing people, and they were out there with him, tangling with him, because he wasn't the kind of, they were looking for a Messiah. They believed in the afterlife and the Satan and the devils and the angels and all those things. But they were not looking for this kind of Messiah. They were looking for a Davidic warrior Messiah who's going to drive the Romans away and restore the kingdom. So that's kind of the background. Now, why did I say at the beginning, he said my real enthusiasm is why, of course God picked the perfect time, but what about this made it perfect? Well, Jesus was going to be a Jewish Messiah. That was the plan all along. So he had to come to the Jewish homeland in a time there was a significant Jewish community there, at the time there. But what was important at the time? Well, remember what I said earlier. What you had was the largest unified government system in Europe and the Mediterranean, really until the European Union came along. It was almost bigger than the European Union, not quite. But if you traveled, and the Roman Empire ran from across the Jordan toward Iraq, where Iraq is now, all through Egypt, all through North Africa, up through Spain and Portugal and the Iberian Peninsula, up across France into Belgium, a little bit of Holland, up to the Rhine River, and then all of England and Wales. They didn't conquer Scotland. They probably could have. Scotland probably wasn't worth conquering at the time. My family's Scottish, but it's not a great agricultural area. So they probably just stopped, because Hadrian's Wall was more of a customs area where you'd come and check in and they'd let people through and trade and all that. And then went across where the Rhine is and down through Romania and all of Turkey. So you could travel from Jerusalem to Londonium, which is now London, without having to have any kind of documentation, without having to go through customs. Didn't have any of that. It was all one empire. With that, you had free trade everywhere. And free trade produced prosperity, so the empire was very prosperous and people wanted to join it. But what it did for the church is two things. One, you had free travel. So when Paul went on his missionary journeys from Jerusalem up into central Turkey, western Turkey, down through Greece, back to the Holy Land, back out on a ship, crashed in Malta, ended up in Rome, he didn't have to go through any kind of international crossings. That was all one government. So it was a perfect time for the new religion to arrive and spread through the empire. The second thing was they all spoke Greek in the eastern half of the empire. So you could write your scriptures in Greek, which they had. Had the Septuagint of the Jewish scriptures. They had the Paul's letters, which were passed down. They were all in Greek. So when Paul would leave Tarsus and go up into Galatia and Ephesus and all these, they all spoke the same language. So they could all understand him, and he could make his message. He could go into Athens and make his message. They could all read his letters and pass them around between the various churches. He had that one language of the eastern part of the empire. Even down in Alexandria in Egypt, they all spoke Greek. And there was a lot of Christian growth besides just Paul's missionary journeys. Christians grew up in Egypt. We don't know how. We have no record of it. Grew up in the eastern part of Turkey in a kingdom called Edessa. Edessa was the first Christian kingdom about 200 AD. The king declared a Christian kingdom. They got all the way across North Africa. But they had a second language which allowed for the spread easily once you got to Rome, because the language of Rome and Western North Africa and Spain and France and Britain was Latin. So you had two universal languages that allowed the church to grow dramatically, because even though it was a Roman execution that killed the Messiah to create the resurrection, yeah, but death we had resurrection. Within 300 years, the Christianity had taken over the empire. Constantine was the Christian emperor, a very interesting man. I believe very strongly that he was a truly sincere Christian warlord, which is an interesting contrast in thing, but very sincere about these things. So it was the perfect timing. It's absolutely, that's when Jesus was going to come, to allow this different religion, very strange religion of loving each other, not conquering each other, loving each other, giving to each other, generosity to each other. Faith in your reward is going to be in the hereafter when you live with God in heaven, rather than being rich or famous or powerful here on earth. It's a revolutionary religion, which is what it's supposed to be. And it could expand through the whole empire by 300 years. This is all foot transport. When you were going from Jerusalem to Athens, you either sailed along the coast or you walked up through Asia Minor. That's a long way. It's all foot power, no mechanical anything. So it's the perfect time, and that's why Jesus came at that time in that place, because of the Roman Empire. Did the Romans execute him? Sure. That's what crucifixion was. But you had to have a crucifixion, a public death, before you could have this wondrous public resurrection. So that's the timing. The timing, of course, was perfect. God chooses these things, not me. So I'm going to stop here. The next lesson we're going to do on the development of the Christian New Testament. Remember, we've covered all the New Testament books in the previous lessons. We're going to describe how it came together. And it's interesting to come shortly after what we did, the Jewish text coming together a couple of weeks ago in a previous lesson. So that's going to be, so you don't have any reading for the next time. That'll be the development of the Christian canon. It's really very, very interesting. This is Dr. Guthrie. It's a pleasure to be back. Thank you very much.